In the deep, shadowed hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where the ridges fold into one another like a closed fist, there are stories that cling to the soil like poison ivy. They are not the sort of tales told around a winter fire for a pleasant fright, but rather whispers passed in hushed tones, confessions coughed into a cupped hand when the listener is sworn to silence. Among these dark legends, none casts a longer or more grotesque shadow than the one concerning the Blackwood brothers and their barn. In the year 1898, the official count of missing women in the region, women who had simply walked out of their lives and into the dense, unforgiving woods, stood at a chilling 21. There were drifters, unwed mothers, traveling peddlers, women with no roots, and no one to raise a proper alarm. They vanished, and the world, it seemed, did not notice their absence. But in the small, insular community of Harrow Creek, they noticed. They knew, and they whispered of the barn that stood on the Blackwood property, a hulking, windowless structure of gray, weathered timber, a place from which no sound ever escaped, and from which no visitor was ever seen to leave. The story was a disease of the local memory, a shared nightmare that the townsfolk endured in a collective, unspoken pact. They said the Blackwood brothers, Jedediah, Silas, and Malachi, were not farmers of pigs or cattle. They were farmers of something else entirely. The terrible brothers' barn, as it came to be known in these hushed retellings, was not a place for livestock. It was a place for luring, a place for keeping, a place where the screams of the lost were absorbed by the ancient wood and the indifferent stone of the Ozark Hills. For 20 years, the disappearances had been a slow, steady drip of terror, each one adding another layer of grim certainty to the local lore. And for 20 years, the machinery of justice, such as it was in those isolated parts, remained silent, its gears rusted shut by fear and a strange, almost pious respect for the Blackwood name. The question that lingered in the air, thick and suffocating as summer humidity, was not whether the stories were true, but how such an atrocity could fester in plain sight, protected by a conspiracy of silence, so complete it was as if the entire valley had sworn a blood oath. This is the story of the man who came to break that oath, and the terrible truth he unearthed from beneath the floorboards of a community's soul. It is the story of what was found inside that barn, a horror so profound it threatened to prove that the deepest parts of the wilderness were not in the mountains, but inside the hearts of men. The land remembers, even when people try to forget. And the soil around the Blackwood barn had the bitterest memory of all. The catalyst for truth often arrives as an outsider, an unassuming figure who stumbles into a web of secrets without realizing the strands are sticking to his boots. In the autumn of 1898, that figure was Arthur Crane, a journalist from the St. Louis Chronicle. He was a man of ink-stained fingers and a methodical mind, more accustomed to documenting city corruption and political theater than the folk superstitions of the backwoods. He had come to the Ozarks not in pursuit of monsters, but on a far more mundane assignment: to write a series on the burgeoning timber industry and its impact on the remote communities of southern Missouri. Harrow Creek was to be his final stop, a small, self-contained world nestled in a valley that seemed to begrudge the intrusion of the single railway spur that connected it to the outside. Crane was a man who believed in facts, in evidence that could be held and examined. He saw the world in columns of text and verifiable sources, and he possessed a professional disdain for rumor and hearsay. He first heard the story of the Blackwood barn in the town's only tavern, a low-beamed room that smelled of stale beer and wood smoke. It was not told to him directly, but overheard, a fragment of conversation between two old men who thought him out of earshot. Their words were sparse, laced with a fear that intrigued him more than the content itself. Another one gone. One had murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "The barn's hungry this season." Crane, turning on his stool, had asked them what barn they meant. The change in the room was instantaneous and palpable. The low murmur of conversation ceased. The two old men stared into their glasses as if they contained the secrets of the universe, and the bartender, a man with a hard, flat face, gave Crane a look of undisguised hostility. "Just old stories, mister," the bartender said, his tone leaving no room for further inquiry. Things men say when they've had too much to drink. But Arthur Crane had the reporter's instinct for the truth that lies just beneath the denial. The fear in the room was not the fear of a ghost story. It was the fear of something real, something present. Over the next few days, he found that the name Blackwood was a key that locked every door. Mention it, and conversations would wither. Eyes would shift. People would suddenly remember urgent tasks elsewhere. The Blackwood brothers, he learned through careful, indirect questioning on the largest timber operation, the mill, the general store, and the mortgage on half the farms in the valley. They were the unelected kings of Harrow Creek, their power absolute and seemingly benevolent. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, Crane could feel the oppressive weight of a secret. The whispers of the barn and the 21 missing women were not folklore. They were a symptom of a deep and terrifying sickness. And Arthur Crane, a man of facts and reason, found himself becoming obsessed with a story that had no sources, no evidence, and no witnesses. He decided to extend his stay. The timber industry could wait. A darkness was coiled at the heart of Harrow Creek, and his very nature would not allow him to walk away until he had looked it in the eye. He felt a pull, a grim responsibility that he could not yet name, to give voice to the silence that was screaming all around him. The conspiracy of silence was a living entity in Harrow Creek. It had 1,000 eyes in the windows of the small, clapboard houses and 1,000 ears in the rustling leaves of the sycamore trees. It was a fortress, and Arthur Crane spent the better part of a week throwing himself against its unyielding walls. He began at the official source of law and order, the office of Sheriff Brody. The sheriff was a man in his late 50s, with a weary face and a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform. His office was a small, dusty room where flies buzzed lazily in the afternoon sun, a perfect metaphor for the state of justice in the county. When Crane presented his questions, delicately at first, about the pattern of disappearances over the years, Sheriff Brody's affability curdled into a kind of weary impatience. He leaned back in his creaking chair, steepling his fingers over his belly. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, a practiced lecture for outsiders. "You city folk have a taste for the dramatic. These mountains, they're a hard place. People move on. A woman gets tired of farmer's life. She packs a bag. A girl with a bit of trouble finds her way to a bigger town where no one knows her name. There's no mystery here. There's just life, and life is hard." Crane pressed, mentioning the sheer number, 21, by his informal count from old newspapers and county records of missing persons filed and forgotten. He mentioned the whispers, the name Blackwood, the barn. The sheriff's eyes, which had been evasive, suddenly sharpened, a glint of steel beneath the tired facade. "The Blackwood brothers are the pillars of this community," Brody said, his voice dropping to a low, warning tone. "They've built this town from nothing. They are good, God-fearing men. You're a guest here, Mr. Crane. I'd advise you to show some respect. Peddling vicious gossip will not win you any friends in Harrow Creek." The threat was as clear as the glass in the window pane. This was not a request. It was an order. The law itself was a gatekeeper, standing guard not for the people, but for the powerful. Crane left the office with the cold certainty that the sheriff was not just complicit, but an active participant in the suppression of the truth. His next attempts were with the townspeople. He spoke to the woman who ran the boarding house, a gaunt figure who flinched at the Blackwood name and claimed to have a poor memory for past guests. He tried the blacksmith, a man whose powerful arms were a testament to his trade, but whose gaze faltered and fell to the floor when asked about travelers who might have passed through his forge. They all spoke in folksy platitudes and veiled warnings. "Some trees are best not shaken, lest the rot falls on your own head," one farmer told him before turning his back. "A wise man learns which sleeping dogs to let lie." Every conversation was a dead end, a polite but firm dismissal. They were afraid, but it was more than just fear. It was a kind of ingrained, generational subservience. The Blackwoods' economic stranglehold on the valley meant that to speak against them was to risk not just their wrath, but one's own livelihood, one's home, one's future. The silence was the price of survival. It was a suffocating blanket woven from fear, dependency, and a willful, desperate blindness. Arthur Crane realized he was not just investigating a series of crimes. He was confronting an entire social order built upon a monstrous foundation. And he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he was utterly, terrifyingly alone, denied any purchase on the smooth, cold walls of the town's silence. Arthur Crane turned his attention to the source of the fear itself, the Blackwood estate. The property lay a few miles north of town, a sprawling expanse of land that climbed from the valley floor into the wooded hills. A crude, uninviting road led to a set of imposing iron gates, permanently closed. From a vantage point on a facing ridge, Crane spent 2 days observing the domain of the men who held Harrow Creek in their thrall. The main house was a large, two-story farmhouse, well-kept and painted a stark white, a beacon of prosperity against the wild green of the landscape. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, suggesting a life of domestic comfort. But it was the other buildings that held Crane's attention. There was a small, austere-looking chapel, its steeple a sharp black finger pointing at the sky. And then there was the barn. It stood apart from the other structures, isolated and foreboding. It was enormous, far larger than any agricultural need would dictate, and its construction was peculiar. The timber was ancient and dark, almost black with age and weather. There were no windows, no large hayloft doors, only a single, heavily reinforced entrance on the ground level. It seemed less a barn and more a fortress, a blind, mute sentinel guarding an unspeakable secret. It squatted on the land with a malevolent permanence, a dark heart pumping fear into the valley. From his hidden perch, Crane watched the brothers themselves. They were three distinct figures, each embodying a different facet of their shared monstrosity. Jedediah was the eldest, a man in his late 40s with the bearing of a patriarch. Crane saw him directing workers with a calm authority, his posture erect, his movements precise. Even from a distance, he radiated a powerful charisma, the kind of man who could command loyalty with a word. He was the mind, the architect. Then there was Silas, the second brother. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, a creature of brute force. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, and Crane never saw him speak, only received Jedediah's orders with a silent nod before carrying them out with an unnerving efficiency. He was the muscle, the enforcer. Finally, there was Malachi, the youngest. He was wiry and restless, always pacing, his movements jerky and unpredictable. He often stood near the barn, staring at its blank walls, as if in communion with whatever was inside. There was an air of profound instability about him, a frantic energy that seemed barely contained. He was the chaos, the wild card. Together, they formed a terrifying trinity of control, strength, and madness. They were a self-contained unit, their interactions with their farmhands brief and purely transactional. No one lingered. No one made idle chat. Workers arrived in the morning and fled before dusk, casting nervous glances back at the silent barn as they left. Arthur Crane felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he watched them. The rumors were beginning to take on the solid weight of truth. The brothers' public piety, their reputation as town builders, was a masterfully crafted facade. He was looking at a predator's den, disguised as a model farm. The White House, the pious chapel, they were just camouflage. The real center of the Blackwood world, the true temple of their faith, was the windowless, silent barn. It was a place built to contain things. And Crane was becoming increasingly certain that those things were human. After days of fruitless inquiry and chilling observation, a breakthrough came in the most unexpected form. A child's scrawl on a scrap of paper slipped under the door of his room at the boarding house while he was out. There were only 2 words, written in a shaky, untutored hand: Ilara Vance. Beneath the name was a crude drawing of a crooked tree and a crescent moon. It was a map, a summons. Crane had heard the name before. Ilara Vance was the local pariah, a woman who lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods, halfway up Shadow Mountain. The townspeople spoke of her with a mixture of fear and contempt, calling her a hedge witch, a purveyor of folk remedies and dark knowledge. They said she was touched by madness, that she communed with spirits. In a town that worshipped at the altar of conformity and silence, her isolation and strangeness made her an outcast. She was precisely the kind of person who might dare to speak. Following the crude map, Arthur Crane hiked for 2 hours, leaving the manicured oppression of the valley for the wild, untamed chaos of the forest. The path dwindled to a deer trail, and the air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and pine. He found her cabin in a small, secluded clearing. It was a ramshackle affair of rough-hewn logs and a moss-covered roof, with a garden of strange-looking herbs growing in tangled profusion. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Alara Vance herself emerged as he approached, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. She was a woman made of hickory and wire, her face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, her eyes as bright and sharp as a hawk's. She was perhaps 70, but she stood with a straight-backed defiance that defied age. "You're the newspaper man," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've been asking about the Blackwoods." Her voice was a low, gravelly whisper, the sound of stones rubbing together. Crane nodded, keeping his hands visible. "I was told you might be able to help me." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Help you? No one can help. This town made its bed with the devil a long time ago. All that's left is to lie in it." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze so intense it felt as if she were weighing his soul. The silence stretched, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. Crane felt that this was a test. He did not speak, but met her gaze with a steadiness he did not feel. He had to show her he was not just another thrill-seeker, another tourist of tragedy. He was there for the truth, no matter how ugly. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. She lowered the shotgun. "They don't like people talking to me," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "It's dangerous. For you. For me. The truth is worth the danger," Crane replied, his voice quiet but firm. She looked at him again, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Was it hope, or just the weary recognition of another fool destined for a fall? "Maybe," she rasped. "Maybe not. Go away now. Come back after moonrise tomorrow. And don't let anyone see you." With that, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows of her cabin, the heavy wooden door closing with a sound of finality. Arthur Crane was left alone in the clearing, the weight of her words settling upon him. He had found his ally, but in doing so, he had stepped out of the shadows and into the line of fire. He was no longer just an observer. He was a conspirator. The following night, under the sliver of a crescent moon that offered little light, Arthur Crane made his way back to the isolated cabin. The forest was a different creature in the dark, a place of unseen movements and imagined threats. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep, every hoot of an owl like a warning. He found Alara Vance waiting for him on her porch, a lantern at her feet casting long, dancing shadows. She beckoned him inside without a word. The cabin's interior was a single room, cluttered but clean. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the air was thick with their complex, earthy scent. A small fire crackled in the hearth, the only light besides the lantern. Alara motioned for him to sit at a small, rough-hewn table. For a long time, she was silent, staring into the fire as if gathering strength from its flames. "You have to understand," she began at last, her voice low and heavy with memory. "Fear is a poison. It gets in the water, in the soil. After a while, you don't even remember what it was like to be brave." She then told him a story that chilled him to the bone, a story she had held in her heart like a shard of glass for 15 years. It was the story of a young woman named Sarah. Sarah was not from Harrow Creek. She had been passing through, a singer with a traveling medicine show, and had been left behind when the show moved on. She was pretty, with a voice like a songbird, and no family to speak of. She was, Alara said, the perfect prey. The youngest one, Malachi, he was the lure, Alara whispered, her eyes dark with the recollection. He had a wild sort of charm to him back then, before the madness fully took him. He courted her, promised her a home, a life. She believed him. She went with him to the farm. Alara paused, taking a shuddering breath. She was there for 6 months. I only know because she escaped. One night, Silas, the big one, got drunk and forgot to bolt herself properly. She ran. She ran all night through the woods, barefoot and bleeding. She came here, Alara's cabin, the home of the outcast, which was the only place a terrified girl would think to run where the Blackwood's influence couldn't reach. Sarah told Alara everything. She spoke of the barn, of the small, lightless cells in its foundation. She spoke of the other women, their faces pale and hopeless in the gloom. She spoke of the brothers' twisted obsession, a vile mission to purify their bloodline by breeding with women they deemed unclaimed. It was a reign of systematic, sexualized terror, a human husbandry project born of madness and unchecked power. Sarah was pregnant. She stayed with Alara for a week, haunted by nightmares, before the fear drove her on. Before she left, vowing to run until she reached the ocean, she gave Alara the only thing of value she had managed to create during her captivity. She had found a scrap of wood and a rusty nail, and in the long hours of darkness, she had carved a small, crude bird. It was a desperate symbol of the freedom she craved. Alara rose, went to a loose stone in the hearth, and retrieved a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She placed it on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was the bird. It was no bigger than Crane's thumb, but felt as heavy as a tombstone. It was real. It was proof. She also told me something else, Alara said, her voice barely audible. Jedediah, the pious one, he's a man of records. He keeps a book, a ledger. He documents everything, like a scientist studying insects. Sarah saw him writing in it in the chapel. She said he keeps it hidden there, in a place no one would ever think to look. Alara fixed him with a final, piercing gaze. I've kept this secret for 15 years out of fear, but I'm an old woman. My time is short. The dead deserve a voice, and the devil deserves his due. What you do with this knowledge is on your soul now. The storm that broke over Harrow Creek 2 nights later was a biblical tempest, a violent outburst of nature that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Arthur Crane's own heart. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, driven by a wind that howled like a tortured animal. It was the perfect cover. Clad in dark, oilskin clothes, a small satchel containing a pry bar, and a lantern slung over his shoulder, Crane made his way toward the Blackwood estate. The journey was a battle against the elements. The road had turned to a river of mud, and the thunder was a deafening, continuous roar that shook the very ground. He felt a primal fear, but it was overshadowed by a cold, righteous resolve. He was no longer a journalist. He was an avenger, an agent of the ghosts who whispered in his mind. He bypassed the main gates, cutting through the dense woods that bordered the property. The trees thrashed in the wind, their branches clawing at him like skeletal hands. Finally, through the deluge, he saw it, the sharp black steeple of the chapel, silhouetted for a moment against a flash of lightning. The chapel stood apart from the main house, a monument to a fraudulent faith. Crane approached it with the caution of a soldier entering enemy territory. The door was locked, a heavy, oaken thing. He wedged the pry bar into the frame, putting his shoulder into it, the splintering of wood lost in the symphony of the storm. The door groaned and gave way. Inside, the air was cold and musty, smelling of old wax and decay. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the interior in a series of stark, terrifying tableaus. A simple altar, a dozen rough pews, a large, severe-looking cross on the far wall. It was a place utterly devoid of warmth or grace. Sarah's words, relayed by Alara, echoed in his mind, in a place no one would ever think to look. It wasn't the altar. It wasn't the floorboards. It had to be something more personal, more symbolic of Jedediah's hypocrisy. His eyes were drawn to the cross. It was massive, nearly 6 feet tall, carved from a dark, polished wood. He ran his hands over its surface, feeling for a seam, a catch, anything out of the ordinary. Near the base, his fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation. He pressed. With a low groan of well-oiled hinges, a section of the wall behind the cross swung inward, revealing a dark, recessed cavity. His heart hammered against his ribs. He lit his lantern, the flames sputtering in the damp air, and held it up to the opening. Inside, resting on a velvet cloth, as if it were a holy relic, was a single, large leather-bound book. The ledger. He reached in, his hands trembling, and lifted it out. It was heavy, its leather worn smooth by frequent handling. There was no title on the cover, no inscription. It was an anonymous monument to an unspeakable evil. He carried it to one of the pews, set down his lantern, and opened it. The first page was headed not with a date, but with a title, an account of the acquisitions for the furtherance of the Blackwood lineage. The script was a precise, elegant cursive, the hand of an educated man. It was cold, clinical, and utterly monstrous. The first entry was dated 20 years prior. Item number 1, it began, name, unknown, a traveler, acquired May 12, 1878. Disposition, barren, unsuitable for the project. Expired June 1st, 1878. Interred west pasture. Arthur Crane had to close his eyes. The breath caught in his throat. It was all real. The whispers, the fear, the 21 missing women. Here they were, reduced to items, to entries in a madman's logbook. He had found the heart of the darkness. And now, its terrible secrets were in his hands. The flickering lantern light cast a ghoulish glow on the pages of the ledger as Arthur Crane began to read. Each entry was a hammer blow, a meticulous, dispassionate catalog of human suffering. The elegant script was a horrifying counterpoint to the brutality of the words. Jedediah Blackwood had not merely recorded his crimes. He had curated them, documented them with the detached precision of a botanist classifying specimens. The book was a testament to a profound and organized madness, a philosophy of evil masquerading as a generational duty. Crane forced himself to read on, to bear witness. He felt a sacred obligation to learn the names, to reclaim these women from the anonymous horror of their final moments. Entry after entry painted a picture of calculated predation. The brothers targeted the vulnerable, the transient, the forgotten. They were ghosts even before they were taken, women whose disappearance would create no ripples. Entry number 2 read, name, Mary Ann Poole, itinerant seamstress, acquired August 3rd, 1879. Disposition, strong constitution, but defiant. Attempted escape, subdued by Silas. Expired August 20th, 1879. Interred west pasture. The phrase subdued by Silas was repeated throughout the early entries, a clinical euphemism for a violence Crane could scarcely imagine. The west pasture, he realized with a wave of nausea, must be a graveyard, an unmarked field of bones. The ledger was organized by what Jedediah called the project. The women were not people. They were potential vessels. Their value was measured by their health, their perceived fertility, their docility. Those who were deemed unsuitable, too old, too sick, too rebellious, were disposed of with chilling speed. Their lives were snuffed out with no more ceremony than that of a failed crop being torn from the earth. Crane's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. The storm outside a distant, muffled roar compared to the storm of rage and grief building inside him. He found an entry for a girl of only 16. Entry number 5. Name, Lily. Ran away from a neighboring county. Acquired April 10th, 1882. Disposition, youthful but weak-willed. Frightened easily. Found to be with child upon acquisition. Sire unknown. The project requires a clean slate. Expired April 15th, 1882. Interred west pasture. 5 days. A terrified, pregnant child had lasted only 5 days in the clutches of the Blackwoods before their monstrous ideology demanded her extermination. Crane felt a bile rise in his throat. He had covered stories of murder and depravity in the city, but this was different. This was systematic. It was a factory of death, operating under a twisted charter of self-aggrandizement. The brothers saw themselves not as murderers, but as pioneers, as architects of a superior bloodline, weeding out the weak and propagating their own monstrous seed. The sheer arrogance of the evil was staggering. He continued to read, the names and fates blurring into a litany of despair. A woman who had been a teacher, a pair of sisters who had been traveling to meet their cousin, a widow who had been tricked by Malachi's promises of work and security. Each one was a life, a story, reduced to a few cold lines in a madman's book. Then he found her. Entry number 11. Name, Sarah Mills. Entertainer. Acquired October 2nd, 1883. Disposition, excellent health, strong spirit. A prime candidate. Assigned to the breeding rotation. Showed signs of quickening by month 4. Escaped June 14th, 1884. A regrettable loss of asset and progeny. Security protocols updated. The entry was a cold confirmation of Alara's story. The regrettable loss of asset, not a human being who had fled for her life, but a piece of livestock that had broken its fence. The entry chilled Crane more than the records of death. It was the language of ownership, of absolute dehumanization. This was the true purpose of the barn. It was not simply a place of murder. It was a human farm. As Arthur Crane delved deeper into the ledger, the clinical tone of the entries began to subtly shift. The early records were cold and objective, but as the years progressed, a new element crept in, a tone of frustration, of theological justification, of a spiraling obsession. Jedediah's project was not succeeding as he had envisioned. The entries recorded miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who did not survive. The barn was not producing the superior lineage he craved. It was producing only more death and despair. Instead of questioning his premise, Jedediah seemed to have doubled down, his annotations growing longer, more philosophical, more unhinged. He began to quote scripture, twisting passages to justify his atrocities. He saw the failures not as a consequence of his own horrific cruelty, but as a test from God, or as a result of the impurity of the vessels he had acquired. Entry number 16. Name, Esme Vance. No relation to the Mountain Witch. Acquired March 1st, 1890. Disposition. Found to be carrying a weak heart. Unsuitable for the strain of the project. It is a sorrow that the Lord provides such flawed vessels for his work. We are but instruments of a greater will, and we must be ruthless in our pruning of the vineyard. Expired March 5th, 1890. Interred with the others. The casual mention of Alara, the Mountain Witch, sent a fresh chill down Crane's spine. The Blackwoods knew exactly who she was and held her in the same contempt as the rest of the town. Her isolation was her only shield. Crane's reading became a descent into the maelstrom of Jedediah's mind. The entries became a dark sermon. He wrote of his brothers as if they were apostles in his unholy church. Silas was the hand of judgment, his brutality a necessary tool for maintaining order. Malachi was the voice in the wilderness, his chaotic energy useful for luring the lost and the stray. Jedediah saw himself as the high priest, the visionary, the one burdened with the terrible knowledge and sacred duty of their work. The horror of the barn was not just the physical imprisonment and abuse. It was the psychological architecture that underpinned it. It was a cult of three, with a doctrine of blood purity and divine mandate. This, Crane realized, was how they lived with themselves. This was how they could walk through town, nod to their neighbors, and be seen as pillars of the community, all while presiding over a charnel house. They were not just monsters. They were true believers in their own monstrosity. He finally reached the last entry, dated only a week prior. Entry number 21. Name, Anna. From the looks of her, a city girl. Lost. Acquired September 28th, 1898. Disposition, healthy, strong. Shows defiance, but Silas has a way of tempering the will. She carries the spark. Perhaps she is the one. Perhaps she will be the vessel to finally bear worthy fruit for the Blackwood name. The work continues. God's work. God's work. The two words seemed to mock him from the page. Anna was in the barn now, alive. The realization hit Crane with the force of a physical blow. This was no longer a historical crime he was uncovering. It was active. A woman's life hung in the balance, her fate tied to the pages of this hideous book. He could hear her screams and the howling of the wind outside. The ledger was not just a record of the past. It was a map to a present and ongoing hell. He had to get it out. He had to get help. He carefully closed the book, his mind racing. The storm was his only ally. He wrapped the ledger in his oilskin satchel, extinguishing his lantern. He could not just expose a crime that had happened. He had to stop one that was happening now. He pushed the chapel door open and stepped back out into the raging storm, the weight of 21 souls, and the hope of one resting squarely on his shoulders. The journey back from the Blackwood estate was a frantic, desperate flight. The storm that had been his shield now became his adversary. The mud sucked at his boots, and the wind tore at him, trying to rip the precious satchel from his grip. He was no longer just a man carrying a book. He was a courier from hell, bearing a message that could either save a life or condemn him to join the ledger's grim census. He did not go back to his room at the boarding house. He knew he could no longer trust anyone in Harrow Creek. Every friendly face was a potential mask for a spy, every shadow a potential threat. He made for the only place of sanctuary he knew, the isolated cabin of Alara Vance. He found her waiting, the lantern still burning, her face etched with worry. When she saw the ledger in his hands, a look of profound, terrible understanding passed over her features. There was no triumph, only the deep sorrow of confirmed nightmares. Crane, breathless and covered in mud, explained what he had found, his voice cracking with urgency. He told her about Anna. He told her that one of them was still alive. A new fire lit in Alara's ancient eyes. The fear she had harbored for 15 years was burned away by a sudden, fierce resolve. The telegraph line in town is watched, she said, her voice firm. The station master is Jedediah's cousin. A message for help will become a message for your death. You have to get to the next county, to Pine Ridge. They have a state marshal's office there. It's a 20-mile ride. She gave him what she could, a flask of whiskey, a loaf of hard bread, and directions for an old hunter's trail that would bypass the main roads. Before he left, she placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You bring the law, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice a low command. "You bring the thunder of God down on that house. For Sarah. For all of them." Arthur Crane rode through what was left of the night and all through the next day, pushing his rented horse to its limits. The world of Harrow Creek fell away behind him, but its darkness rode with him. He finally reached Pine Ridge as dusk was falling, a disheveled, wild-eyed man who stumbled into the marshal's office, clutching a mud-stained satchel as if it were his own heart. He laid the ledger on the desk of Marshal Thomas Avery, a stern, no-nonsense lawman, and the story, in all its horrific detail, came pouring out. 2 days later, just after dawn, Arthur Crane rode back into Harrow Creek, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by Marshal Avery and a posse of 6 heavily armed state marshals. They rode in silence, a grim procession of judgment descending upon the unsuspecting valley. They did not stop in the town, but went directly to the Blackwood estate. The confrontation was not a gunfight. It was something quieter and far more chilling. The marshals surrounded the main house as Jedediah Blackwood emerged onto the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, his face a mask of polite inquiry. When he saw the marshals, and then Arthur Crane, his composure did not break. He simply smiled, a thin, cold smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Marshal," Jedediah said, his voice calm and sonorous, "to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Marshal Avery held up the ledger. "I believe this is your property, Mr. Blackwood. We've come to see your project." For the first time, a flicker of something, not fear but pure, unadulterated fury, crossed Jedediah's face. At that moment, Silas emerged from the house, a hulking shadow, and from the direction of the barn, Malachi began to run toward them, screaming incoherently. The standoff was brief. The brothers were outnumbered and outgunned. They were shackled, their reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the cold, metallic click of handcuffs. The final act was the opening of the barn. Marshal Avery himself threw back the heavy bar on the door, revealing the Stygian darkness within. The stench that rolled out was an unholy mixture of filth, fear, and despair. With lanterns held high, they descended a set of stone steps into the foundation. They found the cells just as Sarah had described them. And in the last one, chained to the wall, was a young woman, her eyes wide with terror and a sliver of disbelief. It was Anna. She was alive. The reckoning had come. That night, as the Blackwood brothers sat in irons, destined for a trial that would shock the state, a fire started at their farm. No one claimed to know how it began, but no one made any effort to put it out. The whole of Harrow Creek stood on the surrounding hills and watched in silence as the terrible brothers' barn burned. The flames loped high into the night sky, a massive, cleansing funeral pyre. It was a monument to the 21 women and a testament to the terrible price of silence. Justice had been served, but the valley would forever carry the scar. The soil would remember.